The drought had gone 3 weeks without breaking. Every acre had given up harm, except one corner that no one had thought to look at. She had passed this corner a dozen times. She had never stopped to ask why it stayed green. Beneath decades of leaf litter and silence, something waited.
The stone was cold. In 3 weeks of drought, the stone was cold. She had come looking for a farm. What she had just found beneath the surface of 70 forgotten acres was something else entirely.
The county clerk in Garrett County read the purchase price twice, then looked up over the paper at the woman sitting across from him with the particular expression of a man who believed he owed a stranger the courtesy of a second chance to catch her own mistake. Thessaly Briggs did not correct him. She watched him read it a third time, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. The number was right. It had always been right. She had done the arithmetic so many times in the narrow room she rented above a cooperage on the east side of Cumberland that the figures had worn grooves into her, thinking the way a river wears grooves into limestone, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of patient pressure that eventually leaves something permanent behind. The clerk stamped the transfer document without further comment. Thessaly picked up her copy, folded it into the pocket of her coat alongside the tally sheet she had been carrying for the better part of 3 years, and walked out into the March air of 1,884 with 70 acres of the least desirable farmland in the county legally attached to her name. She had managed the kitchen at the Whitmore Arms in Cumberland for 12 years. Not owned it, managed it. There was a difference that people who had never worked in a kitchen for someone else's profit tended to gloss over, but Thessaly understood it precisely. She understood it every time she placed an order for produce shipped up from Virginia or freighted by rail from farms in Ohio, paying prices that climbed every season, while the quality declined proportionally over the miles between field and plate. She understood it every time she watched a chef reject a crate of wilted lettuce that had left its home soil 4 days earlier, perfectly sound, arrived at a Cumberland kitchen fit for nothing. She had stood on the purchasing side of that transaction for long enough to see exactly what the distance cost, and she had spent the last 3 of those 12 years calculating what it would take to close it. The land she bought had belonged to a man named Harwick, who had worked it for close to 40 years before his hands gave out in his early 70s, and his sons, both of them settled in trades far from farming, sold the property in sections after he passed. The last 70 acres, the least accessible parcel, cut off from the county road by a shallow creek crossing and hemmed in on the north by Orson Flett's cattle operation, had sat without a buyer for the better part of 2 years. The asking price had dropped twice. When Thessaly made her offer, the clerk's expression said everything about what the county thought the land was worth, and everything about how surprised he was that anyone had come to collect it. She drove out to Harwick Hollow the following morning in a borrowed wagon, alone. The creek crossing was lower than she had expected for March, the water running clear over flat limestone shelves, and the lane beyond it rose through a stand of second-growth timber before opening into what had once been the main yard of the farm. She pulled the wagon to a stop and sat with the reins loose in her hands for a long moment, looking. The barn leaned eastward at an angle that the contractor she had hired for a single consultation 2 weeks earlier had called manageable, which she understood to mean that it would cost money she did not have to make it right, but would not fall on its own before she had the chance to earn that money. The greenhouse stood 30 feet from the barn's south wall, its iron frame intact and precisely as useful as a greenhouse frame without glass, which was to say, not at all, except as a structure that could become useful again if someone was willing to order replacement panes in bulk from a salvage supplier 2 counties east and install them one at a time by hand. The machine rusting at the edge of the yard was the tractor Harwick had apparently driven to that spot on the last day he had been capable of driving it and left there without ceremony. Its tires had gone flat in the years since. The seat cushion had been colonized by field mice so thoroughly that the original upholstery existed only in theory. The engine, she already knew from the photographs she had brought to a mechanic in town, had seized. Beyond all of it, the pastures stretched in every direction under a skin of growth so dense they had stopped resembling farmland years ago. Multiflora rose, autumn olive, and volunteer ash saplings had come up through the old grass in the decades since Harwick's cattle had last grazed here, filling the open ground with a tangle of woody stems and thorned canes that stood shoulder-high in some places and had swallowed the fence lines entirely. Standing in the wagon seat, Thessaly could not see 20 feet into any of the far pastures. She could see the shape of the land beneath the growth, the rise and fall of it, the darker line of a seasonal drainage channel cutting through the lower field, but the surface itself had been given back to whatever nature had decided to put there in the absence of human intention. Climbed down from the wagon, she was not discouraged. She had expected exactly this, had accounted for it in her calculations, had built the timeline in her notebook around the assumption that the first summer would be mostly clearing work before any real farming began. What she had not fully accounted for and what the book she had been reading in her rented room had not prepared her for in quite the visceral way that standing in the actual yard did, was the specific texture of the silence that came off 70 acres of abandoned land. It was not peaceful. It was indifferent. The land did not know or care that she had bought it. It had simply continued doing what neglected land does, filling the available space with whatever came next after human management withdrew. Thessaly walked the perimeter of the yard, then walked the lane that had once led to the lower pastures, pushing through brush where the path had closed in, until she reached the edge of the main field. She pulled a small folding knife from her coat, cut through a cane of multiflora rose at the base, and dug her boot heel into the soil beneath. The ground gave slightly at the surface, then stopped. Beneath the first inch of loosened dirt, it was firm in the way soil gets when nothing has broken it up for years, and water has run off rather than into it, compressing the upper layers until the biological processes that keep soil open and absorbent have slowed to nearly nothing. She already knew she would need to address this. She just did not yet know how bad it was across the whole property, and she would not know until the clearing was far enough along to let her walk every section without fighting through shoulder-high cane to do it. Orson Flett came by the first Thursday she was on the property. He pulled his wagon to the edge of the lane and sat without climbing down, watching Thessaly work the brush hog she had rented from the equipment dealer in town. She cut the machine's engine when she saw him, partly out of courtesy and partly because she had learned early in her managing years that the information exchanged in the first meeting with a neighbor tended to set the terms of every meeting afterward. Orson Flett was 58 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of permanent squint that came from 30 years of reading weather over open pasture. He looked at the brush hog, then at the barn, then at the rusted tractor at the edge of the yard, and his expression did not change through any of it. When he finally spoke, it was a single sentence delivered without malice, the way a man states a practical observation rather than offers an opinion. Buying a working machine outright would have cost you less than whatever you're going to spend getting that one running. Thessaly thanked him for the thought. She said it without irony and without invitation, the way she had thanked produce suppliers who told her the price was the price, and he seemed to understand the register because he nodded once, clicked his horse forward, and drove back toward his property line without adding anything further. She went back to work. The days that followed had a sameness to them that she found against expectation, settling rather than deadening. She was up before light, out in the yard by the time the first gray came into the sky, working through to dusk with a break in the middle of the day when the spring warmth made heavy labor genuinely unpleasant. She cleared brush section by section, burning what she could in the open areas away from the barn, stacking what she could not burn for later. She ordered the greenhouse glass in 3 separate shipments from a salvage operation 2 counties east, spacing the orders to match what she could pay as the weeks went by, then started replacing panes in the evenings when the light held long enough to work without a lamp. The irrigation lines inside the greenhouse had cracked through years of freeze and thaw, hairline fractures running along the brass fittings, where water had expanded inside the metal and split it. She replaced those herself too, watching instructional demonstrations given by the plumber, who worked the farms outside Cumberland, and asking enough questions that he eventually offered her a printed diagram of standard fitting configurations, which she kept folded in her notebook alongside her soil notes and her produce pricing calculations. At the feed store in town, word had traveled the way word travels in a small county with one reliable gathering place. A woman from Cumberland, no farming background, had bought the Harwick Hollow parcel. The general view repeated in various forms over the flour barrels, and at the long wooden counter where credit accounts were tallied, was that the farm would be back on the market within the year, possibly at a lower price than she had paid. The feed store owner said little on the subject, which Thessaly learned later was his way of indicating that he thought the pessimists were probably right, but did not consider it his business to say so to their face. She did not go to the feed store except to purchase what she needed. She did not offer explanations to people who had not asked for them. She had spent enough years in the Whitmore Arms kitchen to know that the only argument worth making was the one made by results, and that results required time she did not have to waste defending her intentions to people who had already formed their conclusions. The tractor consumed a disproportionate amount of her thinking, not because of sentiment. She had no attachment to the particular machine, had not known Aldrich Harwick, and carried none of the reverence for his memory that might have made the recovery of his tractor feel meaningful in some personal way, but because the arithmetic of the situation was clear. Hiring fieldwork done would cost more than she had budgeted to spend on anything that was not immediately productive. Buying a working tractor outright would take money she had allocated to livestock. Rehabilitating this one, if it could be done at a cost she could actually pay, was the only path through the budget that left enough capital to run the rest of the first year without borrowing. She carried photographs of the seized engine to Cornelius Pasque's shop on a Tuesday in early June, having heard his name from the owner of the equipment dealer where she rented the brush hog. Neil Pasque was 67, his shop a converted smithy on a dirt lane 2 miles outside town, its walls hung with decades of accumulated tools in an arrangement that looked chaotic and was, She understood quickly, organized by a logic entirely his own. He studied the photographs for several minutes without speaking, then set them on the workbench and gave her a number for his labor that was not unreasonable given the scope of what the photographs showed. Then he said something else. He said it looking at the photographs rather than at her, which she noticed, and she filed the observation alongside her read of every other person she had met in Garrett County so far. If you'd rather learn the work than pay for it, I do that too. Weekends, half the rate. She said yes before he had finished the sentence, and something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a slight recalibration. The way a man looks when he offered something expecting to be turned down and finds he has to actually mean it now. They started the following Saturday. Neil's teaching method was specific. He explained a thing once, demonstrated it once, then handed her the tool and stepped back. If she made an error, he described the error in mechanical terms and let her correct it herself. If she made the same error twice, he described it again with slightly more detail. He did not lose patience, and he did not take the tool back from her hands. Over the course of June, she learned to free a seized piston using penetrating oil, heat from a small torch, and a degree of patience she had not previously associated with mechanical work. She learned to disassemble and clean a fuel system that had sat dry for years, the residue in the lines having crystallized into something closer to varnish than anything liquid. She learned to rebuild a carburetor from the float-up, setting the mixture by ear once the engine was close enough to running to give her something to listen to. The greenhouse glass was mostly in by July. She had done the glazing herself, working from the ridge down on each panel, so that the finished sections shed water, rather than collecting it at the joints, a method she worked out through trial and error on the first 2 panels and applied consistently to the rest. The irrigation lines were repaired. The interior beds were framed and filled with a mix of existing soil and composted material she had been accumulating in a bin near the barn since the first week on the property. She had seeds already had ordered them in February, before she had even closed on the purchase. A diversified selection weighted toward the vegetables she knew from 12 years of kitchen purchasing, were the ones chefs in Cumberland consistently paid the highest prices for and had the most trouble sourcing reliably within the season. Heirloom tomatoes, several varieties of tender lettuce, French breakfast radishes, shelling peas in 3 colors. She knew the demand because she had been the demand, placing those orders herself from the other side of the transaction, and that knowledge was worth more than the cost of the seeds. In the first week of May, while the greenhouse work was still ongoing and the brush clearing had progressed far enough to expose most of the old fence lines, Thessaly walked the central section of the farm for the first time, without fighting through shoulder-high growth to do it. She had been looking forward to this. The central section was the largest flat area on the property, sheltered from wind by the woodlot to the west, with good southern exposure and what appeared from the topography to have been the main crop ground during Harwick's years of active farming. She cut through the remaining ground cover with her boot heel in several spots across the section, pressing down to feel the soil beneath. Then she walked to a different spot and did it again, then a third. By the 4th trial, she had stopped looking for contrary evidence and started accepting what the ground was telling her. The soil in the central section was compacted to the depth of an iron pan. Aldrich Harwick had run cattle on this parcel for decades, concentrated in the flat central area during wet weather when the surrounding slopes were too soft for heavy animals to move on without tearing up the surface. The cumulative weight of that concentration had pressed the soil into a condition that was not, technically, dead microbes survived in compacted soil. Worms found their way through it in small numbers but was as close to functionally inert as land could get while still sitting there looking like farmland from a distance. Nothing she planned to grow would root properly in it. Nothing she planted would produce at the volume her budget required. She stood in the middle of the central section for long enough that the shadow of the woodlot had moved perceptibly before she walked back to the house. That evening, she sat on the porch step with her notebook open to the budget page and spent an hour going through the numbers she had already examined dozens of times. They did not improve with re-examination. The central section had been the foundation of her planting plan. Without it in production by June, the revenue she had projected from the produce operation in the first year dropped below the threshold she needed to cover livestock feed costs, which meant the cattle she had been planning to buy in the spring would be underfunded before she had owned them a season. She could scale the cattle back. She could delay the cattle entirely and focus on the greenhouse. She could try to work the compacted ground with the tractor she did not yet have running and hope that mechanical tillage alone would break up what decades of hooves had packed down. None of those paths led where she needed to go on the timeline she had set. She turned to a fresh page in the notebook and started writing. Not calculations this time. Questions. What was the actual mechanism by which compacted soil recovered? How long did it take under different methods? What was the fastest approach that did not require inputs she could not afford? She had read enough about regenerative practices in her rented room to have a vocabulary for the problem. She needed someone who could translate that vocabulary into decisions she could actually make on this specific piece of ground. The name Dorothea Swain came from a pamphlet she had picked up at the county extension office in Garrett County, a printed document about soil conservation practices for small farms issued by the state agricultural office the previous year. The pamphlet was dry and technical in the way official documents from agricultural agencies tend to be, but the underlying information was solid, and the name at the bottom of the last page, listed as the point of contact for farm consultation services through the state conservation district, was followed by a Cumberland address that meant she was, at least in theory, reachable. Thessaly wrote her a letter that same evening, not a long letter. She described the property, the compaction problem, what she had been reading, and what she did not know. She said plainly that she could pay for one consultation visit, could not pay for more than one, and wanted to get as much useful information as she could from a single afternoon if Dorothea was willing to come. Dorothea wrote back within a week. She would come in August. July and August became the months of the engine. Each Saturday in Neil's shop, the tractor's resurrection continued by increments too small to be satisfying week to week, but significant when she looked back at where they had started. The carburetor rebuild was completed in mid-July. The fuel lines flushed and refitted. The fuel tank drained and cleaned of the gummy residue that had accumulated over years of evaporation. The battery was beyond saving, and she replaced it with a rebuilt unit Neil sourced from a supplier in Frederick. The cooling system had a crack in the upper hose fitting that she repaired herself with a cast iron patch kit Neil talked her through, the repair requiring 3 separate attempts before the seal held under pressure without weeping. Neil watched her third attempt without speaking. When the fitting held, he simply moved on to the next item on his mental list, the ignition timing, and she understood that in his shop success was its own acknowledgement and required no further comment. On a Saturday in the 3rd week of August, with the morning light coming through the open doors of the smithy at a low angle and lying gold across the concrete floor, Neil reached over and set the choke while Thessaly held the ignition switch. She turned it. The engine turned over twice with a sound like something waking up badly, then caught on the second cycle and settled into a rough, uneven idle that gradually smoothed as the oil pressure built and the cooling water began to move through the system. She did not celebrate. She stood with her hand on the warm block of the engine and felt it running under her palm, and what she felt was not triumph but something quieter and more durable. She had taken a machine that had not run in years and made it run again, not by hiring someone to do it for her, but by learning, over 2 months of Saturdays, what was wrong and how to fix it. That was a different kind of knowledge than she had possessed in June. It would be available to her in ways that paid labor never was. Neil handed her a clean rag. Cold mornings, let it warm 5 minutes before you put it to work. That was the entirety of his commentary on what they had just accomplished together, and she accepted it as the complete and sufficient thing it was. She drove the tractor back to Harwick Hollow herself on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, taking the county road at the machine's best traveling speed, which was not fast. The road passed Orson Flett's property line at the northern boundary, a stretch of clean post and rail fence bordering a pasture where a dozen red and white cattle stood in the afternoon shade of an oak grove. She heard the gate latch before she saw him. Orson had come out to the fence line, drawn either by the sound of the engine or by the timing of his own afternoon routine, and he stood with his forearms on the top rail watching the tractor pass at the pace of a determined walk. She did not slow down, and she did not look away from the road, but in her peripheral vision, she could see him standing there with the stillness of a man who has revised an opinion but has not yet decided what to do with the revision. The engine ticked along rough but steady under the summer afternoon sky. Behind her, she could feel him still standing at the fence long after the road had bent away from his property line and carried her out of his sight line, and that feeling, not triumphant, not vindicated, just recognized, settled into something she carried the rest of the way home, without needing to name it. The tractor made it through the creek crossing on the first attempt and up the lane to the yard of Harwick Hollow without incident. She parked it in the barn's shade, not inside the leaning structure, but close enough that the overhang gave some protection from the weather. The engine died when she cut the ignition and the yard went quiet around her again, the late afternoon insects beginning their evening sound in the brush at the field edges. Thessaly climbed down, walked around the tractor once, and checked the temperature of the engine block with the back of her hand. Warm but not hot. The oil had held its pressure for the entire drive. The cooling system had not leaked. She allowed herself, standing alone in the yard of a farm nobody had wanted in a county that had already decided what was going to happen to her, exactly the amount of satisfaction the moment warranted. Then she went inside to write her evening notes, because the tractor running was not the plan. It was the condition that made the plan possible, and those were different things. And she had learned 12 years ago in a kitchen that confusing them was how people ended up celebrating too early and arriving too late. Dorothea Swain arrived on a Wednesday morning in the first week of September, driving her own wagon up the lane from the creek crossing with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had visited enough struggling farms to know that the first impression the land made on her mattered more than any conversation she might have before stepping out of the seat. She was perhaps 50, compact and deliberate in her movements, wearing a canvas work coat with a soil probe clipped to the outside pocket the way a physician carries instruments not for show, But because the tool was the point of the visit, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise, Thessaly met her in the yard. They shook hands, and Dorothea did not compliment the property, which Thessaly noted and appreciated. Instead, Dorothea looked at the repaired greenhouse, the tractor parked in the barn's shade, and the visible edge of the cleared pasture beyond the outbuildings, then said, "Show me the compaction problem first. Everything else I can see from the outside." They walked the central section together, Dorothea stopping every 20 feet or so to push the soil probe into the ground and read the resistance, pulling it back, examining the core on the end of it, pressing it in again at a slightly different angle. She did not narrate her findings as she worked. Thessaly walked alongside her and watched without offering interpretation, understanding that what was happening was a process that required its own attention and would produce its own conclusions in its own time. At the far end of the central section, Dorothea pulled the probe free from a spot near the old feeding area, where the compaction was worst, and held the core up to the light. The soil column it showed was dense and uniform, almost no variation between the surface layer and what lay 6 inches down. In healthy ground, that transition held evidence of biological activity: root channels, worm castings, the slight loosening that came from organic matter breaking down and creating pore space between particles. This core showed none of it. It was, Dorothea observed without particular drama, the record of what happened to land that bore too much weight in too few places for too many years. You cannot till your way out of this. She set the probe against her leg, not in one season. The structural damage goes deeper than a disc harrow reaches, and breaking the surface without addressing what's underneath just creates a false seedbed that collapses the first time it gets wet. Thessaly had suspected as much from her reading. Expecting it and hearing it confirmed were not the same thing, and the confirmation settled into her chest with a specific weight she allowed herself to feel for exactly the duration it took them to walk back toward the barn. What Dorothea proposed instead was a system Thessaly had read about in outline, but never seen laid out for a specific piece of ground. Rotational grazing with portable wire fencing. Cattle moved through the property in tight, frequently shifted paddocks, concentrated in small areas for short periods before being moved to the next section. The hooves would do work in the new areas, pressing seed into contact with soil, breaking the surface crust, depositing manure in concentrated doses that would begin feeding the biology underneath. The old areas rested, would begin to recover. The key was the movement. Leave animals too long in any one place and you recreated the problem that had destroyed Harwick's central section over the course of 4 decades. Move them often enough and you converted the pressure from damage into stimulus. Dorothea sketched the paddock sequence on a page torn from her own notebook, marking the water access points, the recommended rest periods, the number of animals the system could support in the first season without overtaxing the recovering pasture. 12 cattle to start, no more. The temptation to stock more would come once the grass started responding. But the math of recovery was not linear, and patience in the first year was worth more than ambition. The system will take twice the labor of conventional grazing, Dorothea said, capping her pencil. You'll be moving fence nearly every day during the growing season. Some people get 3 months into it and decide it isn't worth it. The edge in her voice was not unkind. It was the particular tone of someone who had seen the decision made both ways enough times to have stopped projecting an outcome before the person in front of her had committed to one. Thessaly looked at the sketched paddock sequence. What's the feed cost in the second year if the pasture responds the way you expect? If you move the fence right and don't push the stocking rate, close to nothing in purchased feed from late spring through first frost. Thessaly did not have the money to purchase supplemental feed across a full season. She had budgeted for some as a contingency, but the line item in her notebook was thin and she knew it. What Dorothea was describing was not a philosophical preference for one farming method over another. It was the only financial path through the first 2 years that did not require borrowing against property she had owned for less than a season. She kept the paddock sketch. Dorothea spent another hour walking the greenhouse, the repaired irrigation lines, the soil beds Thessaly had framed and filled, and the slope of the lower pasture where the land dropped toward the creek. She noted the water situation, the farm's single well, old and not deep, drawing from a water table that had served Harwick's smaller operation adequately, but would be under meaningful stress if Thessaly ran the greenhouse at full production through the summer while also watering livestock. It was a concern she filed without making it an alarm. There was nothing to be done about the well depth without money she did not have. She would manage the draw carefully and watch the level. When Dorothea's wagon pulled back out the lane toward the creek crossing late that afternoon, Thessaly stood in the yard for a moment with the paddock sketch in one hand and the soil probe notes Dorothea had left with her in the other, and she allowed herself a clear-eyed look at where she actually stood 6 months into the enterprise. The greenhouse was functional. The tractor ran. The central section was not plantable this season, which meant her first-year produce revenue would come entirely from the greenhouse beds smaller than she had originally planned on and producing less volume. She had enough capital remaining to buy 12 head of cattle in the spring, run the rotational system as Dorothea had designed it, and survive to the end of the first full farming year if nothing went wrong that she had not anticipated. Nothing going wrong that she had not anticipated was not a condition she could guarantee. She went inside and updated the notebook. The cattle came in April of 1,885. 12 Hereford crosses purchased from a livestock operation 2 counties south, loaded onto a hired wagon before dawn and unloaded at Harwick Hollow by mid-morning. Thessaly had spent the preceding weeks driving the fence posts for the first rotation of paddocks herself, a task that required the post driver attachment she had figured out how to fit to the tractor's rear, coupling with a degree of mechanical problem-solving she would not have been capable of in June of the previous year, and that she accomplished now with only one wasted afternoon of incorrect fitting attempts before the geometry clicked into place. The cattle were not impressive animals by the standards of what the county's established operations ran. They were functional, healthy, sound in their feet, docile enough to be manageable by one person without a dedicated cattle dog, which she did not have. She watched them move into the first paddock and settle immediately into the business of grazing, and she noted, as she would note every morning thereafter during the inspection walk, the density of their grazing pattern, the degree to which they were taking the grass evenly across the paddock, rather than selecting certain plants and avoiding others, and the condition of the soil surface after 24 hours of concentrated hoof pressure. The greenhouse had been producing since March. She had started the first flats of seedlings in February, while the snow was still on the ground outside, and the heat from the small coal stove inside was doing the work that the sun would take over by April. The heirloom tomatoes went in earliest, needing the longest lead time. The lettuces followed in succession, staggered by 2 weeks, so that she would have a rolling harvest, rather than a single flush that peaked and then left her with nothing. The radishes were the fastest, spring planted and pulling within 30 days, and they had the additional virtue of being the vegetable she could most reliably sell at the highest price-to-weight ratio, which mattered when she was moving produce by wagon to Cumberland, and every pound was transportation cost as well as product. The letters she had written to the chefs she had worked alongside in her years at the Whitmore Arms produced 3 firm agreements before the first harvest. Not charity, she was clear about that in the letters, and clearer still in the conversations that followed when she rode into Cumberland to speak with each of them in person. She was offering specific vegetables, specific quantities, specific delivery schedules, and specific prices. What she was asking for in return was reliability on their end, an order placed by the first of each month for the following month's delivery, firm enough to plan production around. She had written those terms carefully because she had spent 12 years watching produce suppliers fail to hold to them and watching chefs absorb that unreliability into their costs and their tempers. She intended to be the version of that transaction that worked the way it was supposed to. 2 of the 3 chefs shook her hand on the terms without negotiation. The third adjusted the price on the French breakfast radishes downward by 5 cents per bundle, which Thessaly accepted because the volume he was committing to justified the concession, and because she had padded her opening number by 7 cents in anticipation of exactly this. By June of 1,885, the greenhouse was supplying 3 Cumberland restaurants with a rotating selection that included 4 varieties of lettuce, 2 types of radish, shelling peas in 2 colors, the first of the heirloom tomatoes, and a rotating selection of fresh herbs she had added to the production schedule after a conversation with the head cook at the 3rd restaurant, who had mentioned almost in passing that finding fresh thyme and tarragon before July was the consistent frustration of her early summer menus. Thessaly had gone home and started a flat of each the following morning. The cattle moved through their paddock rotation with the regularity of a system that had been designed with enough care to function on its own logic rather than requiring constant improvisation. She moved the fence every morning before the greenhouse work, a task that took between 40 minutes and an hour depending on the paddock configuration, driving the step-in post by hand and rolling the wire onto the hand reel she had rigged to a bracket on the tractor's side panel. The animals accepted the moves without protest. Each rested paddock, once the cattle had cleared it and it had a week of recovery time, showed a visible change in the grass density coming back, not dramatic. Not the kind of transformation that would make anyone stop their wagon on the county road to stare, but consistent, the kind of change that compounded over weeks into something that began to look like intention. It was Orson Flett who noticed the grass recovery first, which was the unexpected thing. He had been watching the farm from his property line, with the patient attention of a man whose opinion was invested in the outcome, and he came by one afternoon in late June on no particular pretext and stood at the edge of the second rested paddock for several minutes without speaking. Thessaly was repairing a section of the original permanent fencing along the property's east boundary, close enough to hear him if he said anything. He did not for a while. Then he said it into the general air rather than at her directly. Grass looks different than I expected. She set her fencing pliers down on the post. Different how? Fuller. Coming in even. A pause. Harwick never got it to come in even. Always had bare patches where the animals camped near the water. She explained the rotation briefly, the paddock size, the move frequency, the rest period. Orson listened without interrupting, which was new. When she finished, he looked at the paddock again, then at the adjacent section where the cattle were currently concentrated, and she could see him doing the math of it in his head, mapping it against 30 years of his own experience with the way cattle behaved on open pasture. He did not offer approval. He did not offer a converted opinion. He simply nodded once and walked back toward his property. But the visit itself was information. A man who had already decided something did not come back to look at it a second time. July arrived without rain. The first 2 weeks were dry in the way that early July sometimes was in western Maryland. Hot and clear, the soil surface beginning to harden between the tractor's wheel ruts and the grass in the non-paddocked areas of the farm going from green to a faded, dusty olive. Thessaly watched the well level with the attention she had been giving it since Dorothea's warning in September, checking it each morning by lowering a marked length of twine into the casing and measuring the wet point. Through the first 2 weeks of July, it dropped incrementally, a quarter inch some days, an eighth on others, the kind of decline that was notable without yet being alarming. Then the third week arrived and nothing fell from the sky. By the end of July's third week, the well level had dropped to the point where she was drawing water in the mornings and again in the evenings, managing the recovery time between draws to keep from pulling the pump dry. The greenhouse required water every day. The lettuces and herbs were in peak production and could not tolerate more than a day of heat stress without showing it in the quality of the leaf. The cattle needed water twice daily at minimum in the heat, and the portable troughs she had been moving with the fence had to be refilled from the well each morning. She laid it out in the notebook on the 22nd of July. At the current rate of draw and the current rate of decline, she had approximately 10 days before the well level reached the point where she would need to make a decision. The greenhouse could be partially managed by reducing the heat-sensitive crops and prioritizing the root vegetables, which needed less water per week. The cattle could not be managed around their water requirement. 12 animals in a Maryland summer were 12 animals that needed water whether she had it or not. The decision she was approaching was the one she had told herself, back in March of 1884 at the county clerk's desk, would not have to be made. It lived at the bottom of her budget page like a line she had drawn there as a formality. Never expecting to have to cross it, she would sell cattle if she had to. Not all of them selling all of them would end the grazing operation and lose the progress the pastures had made through the spring and early summer in a single transaction. But selling half, 6 animals, would reduce the water demand enough to stretch the well through a dry period and reduce the feed pressure simultaneously at the cost of every expansion plan she had been building toward for the following year. She sat with that calculation on the 23rd of July and did not write anything in the notebook. The morning of the 24th was clear and already warm by 7 o'clock, the kind of morning that announced its intention early. Thessaly did her well check. The level had dropped another quarter inch overnight, then walked the paddock fence to move the cattle into the next section. The dry weather had compressed the grass recovery in the rested paddocks, the heat pulling moisture from the regrowth faster than the roots could replace it, and the current paddock was grazed tighter than she would have chosen under normal conditions. She moved the fence farther into the next section than the rotation called for, giving the animals more ground to cover at lower density, buying time. After the cattle were settled, she walked the lower pasture boundary to assess the forage remaining in the sections scheduled for later in the rotation. The lower pasture sloped gently southward toward the property's low point, where the seasonal drainage channel ran dry in summer but left a slight depression in the land that stayed green a week longer than the surrounding ground when rain was scarce. She had noticed this before and attributed it to the drainage channel's subsurface moisture, the clay subsoil holding water below the root zone for longer than the upslope areas. What she noticed this morning was different. In the far corner of the lower pasture, where the fence line met a dense stand of wild growth, she had not yet cleared one of the last untouched sections of the original multiflora rose tangle. A patch of grass stood fully green in a way that had no business being green on the 24th of July in the third week of a drought. Not olive-toned, not stress-yellowed, not the dull persistence of a drought-adapted species. Green the way grass looked in May, lush at the base, with the slight sheen of adequate moisture on the blade surfaces. Thessaly stood at the edge of it for a moment, then walked in. The multiflora rose canes caught at her coat sleeves. She pushed through, watching the ground rather than the growth above it, and the further into the corner she moved, the wetter the soil became under her boots. Not waterlogged, not a seep in the surface sense, but soft in the way that ground got when moisture was coming up from below rather than down from above. She reached the corner post, an old locust timber that had stood long enough to have bark growing over the nail heads on its face, and looked down. Under the accumulated leaf litter of what appeared to be many decades, where the corner post's shadow had kept the ground shaded and the leaves had built up into a dense mat almost a foot thick, a stone structure emerged from the soil as she scraped the litter away with her boot. Rectangular, perhaps 3 feet across, fitted stone and mortar, with a flat capstone laid across the top that had cracked along one edge and settled slightly, leaving a gap where water seeped upward and darkened the surrounding soil in a circle that extended several feet in each direction. A spring box. Built by hand by someone who had known exactly what they were doing and exactly what they were capturing, at some point far enough in the past that the structure had been entirely swallowed by organic accumulation, and the farm's subsequent owners had either not known it existed or had not thought to look for it. Thessaly pressed her palm flat against the capstone. It was cold. The air coming through the cracked edge carried the specific mineral coolness of water that had been in the ground for a long time and was coming up from somewhere that the summer heat had not touched. She knelt beside the structure and pulled the leaf litter back from its edges carefully, uncovering the full perimeter. Stonework was solid on three sides, the fourth showing the crack she had felt in the cap. The mortar between the stones aged to a dusty gray but intact except at the cap's edge. Beneath the gap in the capstone, she could hear it not loudly, not the rush of something abundant but clearly, the small persistent sound of water moving underground, finding its way upward through whatever channel had been established long before Aldrich Harwick's time, long before whoever had built this structure had laid the last stone on top and walked away from a working spring. She sat back on her heels in the corner of the lower pasture, with the multiflora rows arching overhead and the sound of water moving below the capstone and the sun already high enough to be hot on her shoulders through the canvas of her coat, and she understood that she was looking at the reason the corner grass stayed green. It had always stayed green. She had noticed it as an anomaly and filed it away. The drought had made the anomaly visible enough to follow. Orson Flett was at his fence line that afternoon when she came up the lane from the lower pasture, moving faster than her usual pace. She had not planned to tell him, but he was there. And the information was not the kind of thing that stayed contained when it had implications for every working farm in the county that had been hauling water through a dry summer. She told him what she had found. He listened without speaking, his forearms resting on the top rail, his eyes on a point somewhere past her left shoulder. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she thought he was going to respond with skepticism, the way he had responded to most things in the 14 months she had been his neighbor. Instead, he pushed off the rail and said, "I want to see it." They walked down to the lower pasture together. Orson was not a man who moved quickly or who filled silence with commentary, and the walk to the corner took 4 or 5 minutes in which neither of them said anything. He crouched beside the spring box with the focused attention of someone examining evidence rather than forming an impression. He pressed his fingers into the soil around the structure's perimeter and held them there, feeling the moisture. He put his ear close to the gap in the capstone and listened. When he stood up, his expression had rearranged itself into something Thessaly had not seen on him before. Not softness exactly. More the look of a man confronting something genuinely unexpected after a long time of encountering only what he already knew would be there. "These boxes used to be on every third or fourth farm in this county," he said, "before the drilled wells came in, before everybody started tiling the wet areas out and calling it drainage improvement. My father talked about them. Said his father had built one on the north end of our property, back before the tiling went in the 1860s. He looked at the capstone. I haven't thought about that in 20 years. The repair took the better part of 2 weekends. Thessaly sourced new mortar from the hardware dealer in town, and Orson brought a cold chisel and a small sledge from his own shop without being asked. The cracked capstone could not be salvaged. The fracture ran through more than half its width and would not hold under the pressure of water movement beneath it. She replaced it with 2 fitted pieces of local limestone that a mason's apprentice in town cut to her dimensions, and the fit was not as clean as the original single stone cap, but was tight enough to function. The collection below the cap had accumulated decades of sediment, fine silt that had worked in through the crack and settled to a depth that was reducing the effective volume by almost half. They cleaned it by hand with a small scoop and a bucket, working in shifts because the basin was too small for 2 people to operate in at the same time, and the work required patience neither of them felt urgently, but both applied without complaint. The gravity-fed line to the lower pasture stock trough was the piece that required the most problem-solving. The elevation drop from the spring box to the trough site was enough for gravity flow barely, but enough, and she ran the line using sections of iron pipe she had priced out before starting the project, burying it 18 inches below grade along the pasture slope to protect it from the next freeze. Orson dug the trench with a borrowed spade and his own methodical patience, working the rocky ground with a technique that conserved motion in a way that looked slow until you measured how much ground he covered in an hour. When the line was complete and she lifted the corner of the new capstone to verify the flow, water ran into the pipe and down the slope, and emerged at the trough in a thin, steady stream that would take several hours to fill the tank to a useful level but would not stop. It would not stop today or tomorrow, or in the 4th week of a July that showed no sign of breaking. The cattle reached the trough that evening at the end of their grazing period. Thessaly watched them drink from her position at the paddock corner. 12 animals in the amber light of a July evening, each of them taking the water with the deliberate attention of stock that had been carefully managed through a shortage, and now found themselves standing at something reliable. She did not sell any cattle. She did not cross the line at the bottom of the budget page. The trough filled overnight and was still full. The next morning when she came to check it at 6 o'clock, the water surfaced flat and cold and clear in the early light. Orson was at his fence line the following day, which had become, over the course of their spring and summer, less a coincidence and more a habit he had developed without acknowledging.
How's the level in the trough this morning?
The question was practical in its construction, but carried the particular attentiveness of a man whose own water situation had been on his mind for the same 3 weeks hers had been on hers. She told him the trough had held overnight. He nodded slowly, looking south toward the corner of the lower pasture, where the spring box now sat properly capped and running. "My father's spring," he said, after a moment. "The one the tiling covered." He pulled an aerial survey map from inside his coat, a document she had not seen him produce before, its paper worn soft at the folds, the original pencil lines of the survey grid faded but legible. He had gone home the previous evening and found it. He had not mentioned that he was going to. They spent the afternoon walking his property's northern boundary with the map, Orson reading the old survey lines against the current landscape with the fluency of a man who had inherited the land from someone who had taught him to read it that way. The tiling lines were marked on a separate document he had also retrieved, an agricultural improvement record from the early 1860s that showed the drainage channels installed during the period when wet ground was managed out rather than managed for. Cross-referenced against the survey map, 2 of the tile lines converged at a point near the northern boundary that corresponded with an area of ground that was, even in the current drought, noticeably softer underfoot than the surrounding pasture. They stood on the spot together in the late afternoon, the shadows lengthening across Orson's northern field, the Harwick Hollow tree line visible over the boundary fence to the south. "There's something under there," Orson said. "Not a question." Thessaly crouched and pressed her fingers into the ground the way he had done in her lower pasture 3 weeks earlier. The soil gave in a way that ground directly above a hidden water source sometimes did not conclusively. Not the kind of evidence a surveyor would accept, but with the particular yielding quality she now understood from experience. She did not answer the statement directly. There was no need. They both knew what the next step was, and they both knew it would take more than one afternoon. Back at the farm, the greenhouse production had not slowed for the drought in the way she had feared. The reduced well draw from the gravity line had taken enough pressure off the casing that she could maintain the irrigation schedule through the peak of the hot weather without the level dropping below the recovery threshold. The lettuce was coming in strong. The tomatoes were beginning to fruit in the second week of August. And the shelling peas, her second succession planting, were setting pods along the vine in the particular dense cluster that meant a good harvest was 10 days away. She wrote the Cumberland restaurants their August supply letters, listing what she would have available through the end of the growing season, and folded each letter with the certainty of someone who had stopped doubting whether the inventory would exist and started thinking only about how to allocate it most efficiently. Dorothea Swain came back to Harwick Hollow in the second week of September, as she had said she might, carrying her soil probe and a set of glass sample tubes in a wooden case. She walked each of the paddocks that had been through a full rotation cycle, taking samples at marked intervals, sealing the tubes, labeling them with the date and the paddock number from Thessaly's rotation log. She did not say what she expected to find. She said she would send the results from the laboratory analysis when they came back. They came back in October. Thessaly read the figures twice at the kitchen table before she went outside. The organic matter content in the 3 paddocks that had gone through the most complete rotation cycles had increased, not dramatically, 1/4 to 0.5% in each sample. Numbers that would look unremarkable to anyone who did not understand what they represented in the context of soil that had been compacted and depleted for the better part of a decade. But organic matter built slowly. 0.5% increase in a single season in ground that had been as degraded as Harwick's central boundary paddocks were when she had walked them in May of 1884 was not a number that came from wishful thinking. It was a number that came from the biology in the soil waking up, from root channels opening, from the manure distributed by moving animals feeding microbial populations that had been half-starved under years of set stocking. The land was not healed. It was not even close to healed. But it was moving in a direction that the data could measure, which meant it was moving in a direction that was real, and Thessaly sat with that reality at the kitchen table on an October evening with the laboratory report in front of her and the sound of the tractor cooling in the barn outside, and she allowed herself something she had not permitted in a very long time. She allowed herself to believe that the calculations she had made in that rented room above the cooperage in Cumberland, on a sheet of paper worn soft at the folds from so many rereadings, had been correct. The winter of 1885 came early to Garrett County, the first hard frost arriving in the second week of October and settling into a cold that had a permanence to it by November, the kind that told experienced farmers the season was not going to relent. Thessaly put the cattle onto the final rotation paddock before the ground froze and managed them there through the last weeks of the grazing season, supplementing the dormant grass with hay she had sourced from a farm operation 8 miles south that had run a surplus and was willing to sell at a price that fit her remaining feed budget without breaking it. The hay was not exceptional quality late cut, a little stemmy, but the cattle took it without complaint, and she stretched it by continuing to move them across the available ground, even after the grass had stopped growing, letting the animals harvest what remained in the root zone rather than feeding from a bunk she would have to fill entirely from purchased supply. The greenhouse held its heat through October on the coal stove alone. By November, she was burning more coal than she had budgeted for the month, the night temperatures dropping low enough that the stove needed tending twice between dark and dawn to keep the interior from falling below the threshold the winter lettuce varieties could tolerate. She kept a cot inside the greenhouse for the coldest weeks, sleeping there 3 or 4 nights a week rather than walking the 30 yards from the farmhouse in the dark to stoke the fire. It was not comfortable, but it was cheaper than losing a succession of lettuce to a cold snap she had slept through. The Cumberland restaurants took their November orders without reduction. One of the 3 chefs, the one who had negotiated the radish price the previous spring, wrote her a letter in early November asking whether she could supply winter storage crops through the cold months: turnips, parsnips, winter squash, anything that would hold in a root cellar and come to his kitchen through January and February, at a quality that the produce merchants in town could not match with their shipped-in inventory. Thessaly read the letter twice, noted that he had framed it as a question when it was plainly a request, and wrote back with a price list organized by variety and a delivery schedule that ran through the end of February. She had planted turnips and parsnips in succession through September, specifically because she had expected this conversation to happen, having watched from the other side of that kitchen transaction for 12 years and knowing exactly when the winter supply problem began to hurt. The root cellar she used was the one Aldrich Harwick had built into the hillside behind the farmhouse, a low stone structure with a heavy wooden door that had swelled in the frame and required the particular combination of lifting the handle and pressing the lower panel that she had worked out by trial in her first week on the property. The cellar was cold and steady, the hillside insulating it from the worst of the temperature swings above ground, and it held her turnip and parsnip harvest in good condition through December, without anything freezing or going soft in the way that poorly managed root storage did. She had not gone back to Cumberland since September except to make deliveries. The farm required her presence in a way that did not leave room for social calls or for the kind of town visits she had once made routinely when the Whitmore Arms had been her primary occupation. What she noticed, when she did go into town to make deliveries or to visit the feed dealer or the hardware store, was the shift in how people addressed her. Not dramatically. Nothing in Garrett County happened dramatically, but the brief conversations at doorsteps and loading docks had changed in character from the previous year, when people had spoken to her with the careful courtesy reserved for someone who has done something questionable and has not fully suffered for it yet. Now the courtesy was different. It was the kind extended to a person who has demonstrated, by continuing to exist and function into a second year, that they know something the doubters did not credit them with knowing. The hardware store in December, the owner's wife, a woman who had been uniformly polite to Thessaly since the first week, and no warmer mention that her brother-in-law, who ran a grain operation on the county's eastern side, had asked about the spring box after hearing about it from Orson Flett at the livestock auction in November. She mentioned it the way people mentioned things they wanted to convey without appearing to have carried the information deliberately, and Thessaly understood that the conversation about the spring had traveled farther than she had tracked. Orson himself had spent 3 weekends in November and the first weekend of December excavating the area of his northern boundary where the survey map and the old tiling records had converged on the most likely location for his father's buried spring. Thessaly had helped with the first weekend, then left him to the subsequent ones, when it became clear that he preferred to do the investigative part of the work alone, with the particular privacy of a man examining something that belonged to his family's history as well as his land. He came by the farm on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, his wagon pulling up the lane in the cold without the tentative quality that had characterized his visits in the first year. He knocked at the farmhouse door rather than waiting at the fence line, which was new. She opened the door with her coat already on, having heard the wagon. "Found it," he said. The words were flat and unornamented in the way Orson delivered everything, but there was a current beneath them that she had learned over the past 18 months to read correctly. She got her gloves from the hook by the door and followed him to his wagon without asking for further detail, because further detail would come, and asking for it would only slow things down. The spring on Orson's northern boundary was larger than hers. That was the first thing she registered when they reached it. The stone collection basin was nearly twice the area of Harwick Hollows, the fitted limestone work finer, suggesting either a more skilled builder or more resources available at the time of construction. The capstones were intact, which was why it had not announced itself the way hers had, through a crack that let moisture escape. Orson had found it by following the soft ground downslope from where the tile drain converged, digging carefully through the accumulated fill until the top of the cap emerged from the earth. He had not broken the seal. He had cleared the perimeter, confirmed the structure's integrity from the outside, and stopped. "I wanted you to see it first," he said, not looking at her. He was looking at the capstones. "Before I open it." She understood what he was not saying, which was that she had found hers first and taught him what to look for, and that he was acknowledging this in the only way his nature allowed. She did not make anything of it beyond receiving it for what it was. They lifted the capstones together, the old limestone heavier than it looked, the mortar between the cap and the basin wall having dried to a fine powder over the decades since it was last disturbed. The water below was immediate, not a seep, not the modest upwelling of Harwick Hollow spring, but a genuine flow, cold and clear, moving through the basin with enough volume that the surface rippled visibly in the December light. Orson stood looking into it for a long moment. His face did not do anything that most people would have called an expression. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, "My father said this was the best water on the property. I thought he was talking about the well." She left him with it, walked back to the county road, and gave him the particular privacy the moment required. The kind that had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with the specific weight of finding something your father had known and you had not. Winter settled in fully through January and February of 1886. Thessaly managed the greenhouse through the coldest months with the practiced routine she had established in November: coal stove twice a night on the hardest weeks. Seedling flats started in rotation so that the spring production would have transplants ready when the soil outside warmed enough to receive them. She was starting the second full year of production now, rather than the first, which meant she understood the timing with a precision she had not had 12 months earlier. The tomato flats went in 10 days earlier than the previous year, because she knew from experience that her Cumberland chefs needed them by a date that required starting sooner than she had initially calculated. The lettuce succession was tighterly rather than bi-weekly, because the previous year's harvest data showed a gap in the third week of May when the winter crop ran out before the spring succession caught up, and she had lost 10 days of supply to that gap she would not lose again. The notebook from the first year had been joined by a second one, started in October. The second notebook was different in character from the first: less calculation, more record. Plant dates, harvest weights, delivery quantities, soil temperature readings from the garden beds, well level measurements, cattle weight estimates by month. She was building the picture of the farm across time now, not just surviving the present moment of it. And the difference between those two modes of operation was something she felt in the texture of her daily work, without being able to articulate it easily to someone who had not lived both. February brought 2 weeks of snow that made the county road impassable for delivery wagons on 3 separate occasions. She sent word to the Cumberland restaurants by post on the first closure and arranged to double the following delivery when the road opened, which required having sufficient inventory to fill 2 orders from a single harvest period. She managed it by pulling from the root cellar storage she had held back from the November and December supply, and the chefs received their catch-up deliveries without complaint. One of them, the woman who had asked for the winter storage crops in November, sent a note back with the driver that said only, "Reliable is its own quality." Thessaly pinned the note to the farmhouse kitchen wall above the notebook shelf, not as a sentiment, but as a data point about what the market she was supplying actually valued. Orson's spring was operational by the end of February, the cap restored, a gravity line running down to a new stock tank in his northern pasture that had taken 2 weeks of evening work to install through frozen ground. He had done most of the installation himself, coming to her twice with specific questions about the pipe fitting technique she had used for her own line, and each time receiving the information and leaving without converting the exchange into anything longer than it needed to be. The third time he came, he brought a cured ham wrapped in cloth, set it on the porch railing without comment, and drove away before she had come to the door fully. She stood on the porch looking at the ham and understood it as the complete and accurate thing it was. By March, when the ground began to soften and the first pale green of early spring grass appeared at the base of the previous year's dead stems in the rested paddocks, 2 other farmers in Garrett County had come by the farm to see the spring box, not together separately, on separate days, in the particular manner of people who want to investigate something without appearing to have been sent by the same rumor. She showed them both the capstone, the gravity line, the stock tank in the lower pasture. One of them, a man named Treadwell, who ran sheep on the county's western ridge, asked specific questions about the construction of the new mortar seal and the pipe diameter she had used for the gravity line. The other, a widow named Bassett, who had been farming her late husband's property alone for 4 years and had been managing her stock water through the dry season by hauling from the creek at the county road, said almost nothing during the visit but stood at the trough in the lower pasture for several minutes with an expression Thessaly recognized as the particular concentration of a person calculating what she was looking at against problems she already had. She gave both of them what they had come for, which was information, and she gave it completely, the way she had learned in 12 years of kitchen management that the only kind of help worth offering was the kind that actually helped. The second grazing season began in April with a cattle count that had grown over the winter without additional purchasing. She had not bought more cattle. What she had done was retain 2 heifer calves born to her original 12 head in the late winter, the first animals born at Harwick Hollow in at least a decade based on the evidence she had, and both calves were healthy and growing well on their mother's milk through the early spring. The herd was now 14 effectively, and would be 15 when the second heifer came fully to weight. The rotational system's mathematics shifted slightly, with the additional animals tighter grazing in the active paddock, slightly shorter rest intervals, and she adjusted the fence schedule accordingly, adding a paddock section in the lower pasture she had not used in the first year. The central section of the farm, the compacted ground that had stopped her planting plan in May of 1884, had been in the rotation for 3 full cycles by spring of 1886. Dorothea Swain's October samples had shown the biology waking up in the outer paddocks. The central section's recovery was slower, the compaction there was deeper, the initial organic matter lower, the hoof pressure from the rotation doing work but doing it against a steeper deficit. In April, Thessaly drove a fence stake into the central section by hand and noted, without allowing herself too much from the observation, that the resistance was noticeably less than it had been 2 years earlier. Not good soil yet, but different soil, moving soil. She wrote to Dorothea in April asking for a second round of sampling across all paddocks, including the central section, to establish whether the data from year 2 confirmed the trajectory of year 1 or told a more complicated story. Dorothea wrote back that she would come in September as before. Spring in the greenhouse ran exactly as she had planned it. The tomato transplants went into the beds on schedule, the lettuce succession held its cadence, and the French breakfast radishes came in 10 days ahead of the previous year's first harvest, because she had started them under bottom heat in February rather than waiting for March. The Cumberland deliveries resumed their weekly frequency in late April, and she added a 4th restaurant to the supply list in May, a newer establishment that had opened the previous fall, whose head cook had received her name from one of the 3 existing chefs she supplied, which was a form of recommendation she had not solicited but understood the value of precisely. The 4th restaurant's first order was modest. She did not treat it as an occasion. She pulled the relevant harvest from the beds, wrapped it in the damp cloth she used for all her deliveries to preserve the leaf quality over the 12-mile wagon trip, and included a handwritten note listing what she expected to have available through June. She got a reply within the week. The order for June was larger than May. Orson came by in the last week of May, which was becoming a pattern of its own, not the fence line visits of the first year, where he appeared to be monitoring a situation he expected to resolve in a predictable direction, but deliberate arrivals with a specific purpose. This time the purpose was the aerial survey map, which he spread on the kitchen table while Thessaly put water on the stove. 2 more properties in the county, he said, had drainage tile records from the 1860s improvement period that corresponded with areas of persistent soft ground that their current owners had attributed to clay subsoil or seasonal seep and had never investigated further. He had spoken with both owners at the livestock auction in April. He had not mentioned Harwick Hollow Spring, specifically had spoken about his own property and the restoration of his father's spring, but both men had produced, in the course of the conversation, descriptions of wet areas on their land that had the specific character of buried water rather than surface drainage. Thessaly looked at the survey map where Orson had marked the 2 properties with pencil. One was Treadwell's sheep operation on the western ridge, which confirmed what she had suspected from his visit in March. The other was a farm on the county's southern end she knew only by name. Are you going to tell them what to look for? She set a cup on the table beside the map. Orson picked it up, considered it, set it back down, already did. Told them exactly what you told me. She sat down across from him. Outside, the spring sound of the farm was fully present, cattle moving in the paddock, the creak of the greenhouse frame expanding in the morning warmth. Somewhere in the middle distance, a woodpecker working the dead ash at the field edge. 2 years ago, this farm had made no sound at all. Treadwell's going to find one, she said. Probably. Orson drank from the cup. The other one I'm less sure about. The soft ground might be what they think it is. The conversation moved on to the cattle, the rotation schedule, the hay price outlook for the coming summer. It was a conversation between 2 people who had stopped performing a relationship and were simply in one, which had happened by degrees so gradual that neither of them had marked the moment it changed. By June, the farm had a quality Thessaly had not fully anticipated in her calculations, not in the financial sense, which was tracking as she had planned, but in the physical sense, the sensory fact of it. The pastures that had been shoulder-high brush 2 years earlier were now open grassland, the fence lines visible, the land's topography readable from the lane in a way it had not been when she arrived. The greenhouse caught the morning light through clean glass and threw it across the yard in long rectangles she had begun to think of as reliable rather than remarkable. The cattle moved through their paddocks with the predictability of animals that have been handled consistently and have stopped treating the fence moving as a disruption and started treating it as the shape of their day. The tractor started on the first attempt every morning. She had told Neil Paskey about this in April, when she had driven into town to pick up a replacement fuel filter and stopped at the smithy on her way back. He had been working at the bench with his back to the door and did not turn around when she mentioned it, just continued working the piece in his hands and said, without inflection, "Cold mornings, too?" "Cold mornings first." He nodded, still not turning around, and that was the entire conversation. And she drove back to Harwick Hollow, with the particular satisfaction of having reported results to the person who had helped make them possible, which was a different satisfaction than the result itself and not a lesser one. The summer of 1886 was drier than the previous year in the early weeks. The July heat arriving in the first week of the month with a sustained intensity that had the county on edge by the 15th. Thessaly watched her trough levels and her well level with the attention they required and felt, this time, a steadiness she had not had in July of 1885. The spring box in the lower pasture was running at the same volume it had maintained through the previous summer's worst weeks. The gravity line was intact, the pipe joints she and Orson had fitted the previous August still holding without seepage. The trough filled overnight and stayed full through the next day's heat. When the second week of July produced the same results as the first trough holding, greenhouse maintaining production on managed irrigation, cattle moving through the rotation without visible stress, she acknowledged to herself, privately, without ceremony, that the spring had changed the essential risk profile of the farm. Not eliminated risk. Nothing eliminated risk from land that depended on weather and biology and markets, all three of which operated on their own logic regardless of what a farmer needed them to do. But the water scarcity that had been the sharpest edge of last summer's threat was no longer the edge it had been. She had found the thing buried under decades of accumulated neglect, fixed it, run a pipe from it to a trough, and that act, practical, physical, unremarkable in description, had removed a category of vulnerability she would otherwise have carried through every dry week for the rest of her years on the farm. Orson confirmed in the second week of July that Treadwell had found a spring on the Western Ridge property, the buried box located exactly where the drainage records and the soft ground had suggested, its cap intact and the flow substantial. He had reopened it the previous week and was already running a line. Thessaly received this information at the fence line on a morning, when the heat was already present by 8 o'clock, and the sky had the flat, whitened quality that preceded another dry week. "He's going to tell people," she said. "He already is." Orson looked out at her lower pasture, where the cattle were working the current paddock in the morning shade of the tree line. "At the feed store last Thursday. Said the county's sitting on water it buried itself 50 years ago, and nobody went back to look." She thought about the specific quality of that statement, accurate, plainly put, the kind of observation that moved through a community because it was recognizable to anyone who worked ground that had been managed and mismanaged across multiple generations. Spring boxes were not her discovery and not Orson's. They had belonged to the farms all along, to the farmers who had built them and to the farmers who had come after and failed to ask why a corner of the field stayed green when everything else went brown. In August, a letter arrived from the county agricultural office, addressed to her by name. The office was compiling information about spring restoration practices for a pamphlet they intended to distribute to farm operators in the region the following spring. Would she be willing to speak with the agent compiling the information about what she had done at Harwick Hollow? She wrote back the same day. Yes. Dorothea Swain arrived in the second week of September, exactly as she had the year before, with her probe and her sample tubes and the same deliberate quality of movement that Thessaly had recognized on her first visit as the mark of someone who trusted process rather than impression. They walked the paddocks together, Dorothea taking samples at the same marked intervals as the previous year. Then they walked the central section, which Dorothea had not sampled in the first round because the data from the outer paddocks had been the priority. The central section soil came up in the probe with a texture that was visibly different from what the same ground had produced in 1884. Not transformed, that would take years more, the kind of time that could not be compressed regardless of how well the rotation was managed. But the layering in the core was no longer uniform and dense. There were channels in it, fine ones, the kind left by roots and worm movement, the beginning of the vertical porosity that healthy soil required to hold water and air and support the root systems of the plants she eventually intended to grow there. Dorothea held the core up and turned it in the September light. Another 2 years, maybe 3. Then you can put something in here.
What do the numbers say?
Dorothea returned the core to the probe, pushed it back in, pulled it again from a spot 6 inches to the left. I'll know when the lab comes back. Structure is better than I expected for 2 seasons. A pause, the kind she used when precision mattered to her. You moved the fence right. It was from Dorothea Swain, the equivalent of a considerable statement, and Thessaly received it accordingly. The laboratory results came back in October, delivered by post in the same plain envelope as the previous years. She read them at the kitchen table. In the evening, the lamp turned up enough to read the figures without squinting. Organic matter in the outer paddocks had continued to climb. The 3 best-performing paddocks now showed increases of between 3/4 and 1 full percentage point over the baseline samples from 1884. The central section samples, taken for the first time, were lower than the outer paddocks as expected, but the range Dorothea had found suggested the biology was establishing rather than absent. She set the report on the table and looked at it for a while. Through the farmhouse window, the greenhouse caught the last of the evening light. The glass panels she had installed one at a time through the summer of 884, holding the orange of sunset for a few minutes before the light failed and the structure became only a shape in the dark yard. The second notebook was nearly full. She had started a third in August. Orson came by on a Thursday morning. In late October, the first frost already passed, the pastures showing the pale gold of dormant grass over the recovered ground. He did not come around to the front door this time, but stood in the yard near the tractor, looking at the lower pasture in the particular way he had developed over 2 years of looking at it, not assessing it as he had in the early months, looking for the failure he had expected, but reading it the way a person read a thing they had learned to understand. Came out of the greenhouse when she heard the wagon. He waited until she was close before he spoke, which was his habit. Bassett found hers. He met the widow on the county's southern end, the other property he had marked on the survey map in May. South corner, just where the tile records put it, flows good. She had not known whether the Bassett property would produce one. She had not said so at the time because there was nothing useful to say before the evidence existed. That's 3, she said. 4, if you count Treadwell's. He looked at the tractor for a moment. Feed store's been talking about it for 2 weeks. Somebody said the county's changed. Somebody else said it hasn't changed. We just stopped looking at it right. The air was cold and still. The October sky, the flat blue that preceded the season's first serious cold. The cattle were in the barn paddock now, their breath visible in the morning chill. The hay she had purchased for winter already stacked under the repaired lean-to on the barn's south side. Which one did you say? She asked. Orson thought about it for a moment with the deliberateness he gave to statements that would travel further than the conversation they started in. I said the land didn't change. The people looking at it did. She considered that. It was accurate as far as it went. What she would have added, if she had been the one speaking at the feed store counter, was that the looking itself required something not genius, not capital, not any particular gift that set one person apart from the people around them. It required the willingness to walk into a corner of a neglected pasture that everyone had written off, get down in the brush, and pay attention to why the grass was green when the rest of the field had gone brown. That was available to anyone. Most people did not do it because they had decided in advance what they would find. She had not decided in advance. That was the entirety of the difference, and it was not a small one. In November, the county agricultural agent came to the farm for the pamphlet interview, a younger man named Corville, who took careful notes in a small book and asked questions that were better than she had expected, specific, practical, interested in the mechanism of things rather than the sentiment of them. He asked about the spring box construction, the gravity line installation, the sample depth for detecting subsurface water movement, the signs in a drought-stressed field that might indicate a buried source beneath. She answered each question fully, the way she had answered Treadwell and Mrs. Bassett, without keeping any part of the method back. When he was done with the spring questions, Corville looked up from his notes. The agricultural office has been receiving inquiries from farms across 3 counties since word got around about the Harwick Hollow spring. People want to know how to look. He paused. I thought you should know the scale of it. She had not thought about the scale of it. She had thought about the spring on her property, then about Orson's, then about the information she gave to the 2 farmers who visited in March. She had not thought about what happened to information that turned out to be useful when it entered a community of people with the same problem. Tell them to look where the ground stays green, she said. In a drought, that's where to start. Corville wrote it down. The farm that winter was quieter than the previous one in the ways that mattered. The operational anxiety of the first year had given way to the steadier work of a second year that had confirmed rather than overturned the calculations she had made in that rented room above the cooperage. The greenhouse ran through the cold months on the schedule she had established. The root cellar held its supply through February. The cattle wintered well on the hay she had sourced, and the dormant pasture ground she had managed carefully enough to leave adequate root mass for the spring regrowth. She filled the 3rd notebook by February and started a 4th. In the early spring of 1887, before the ground had fully softened but after the worst of the cold had passed, Thessaly drove the tractor out to the central section on a morning when the light was still low and the air carried the particular quality of the season, changing from one thing to another. She had not driven onto the central section since the first full season, had kept it in the rotation, but off the active machinery paths to avoid compressing the recovery she was watching the data describe. The machine moved across the ground without the resistance she had felt in the tractor's reaction to the soil in 1884, when the compaction had transmitted itself through the chassis in a subtle but detectable stiffness. The ground under the wheels was not soft. It would not be truly soft for another season or 2, but it was yielding in the specific way that ground yielded when something had returned to it that had been absent. She stopped the tractor at the center of the section and cut the engine. The silence that came in when the mechanical sound stopped was the full silence of early morning on a farm that was no longer abandoned to cattle in the distant paddock. The greenhouse frame, the creek at the property's low end running with the snowmelt that had been feeding it for a week. All of it present, all of it familiar. She looked at the ground ahead of the tractor's front wheels. Dark soil, damp from the snowmelt, showing in the low morning light the slight variation in color and texture, that indicated recovery underway rather than recovery complete. She would not plant this section for another 2 seasons. She would continue moving the fence, taking the data, reading the probe samples when Dorothea came in September. She would do the unglamorous, unremarkable work that the ground required and that produced no image worth carrying to the feed store, no story that resolved in a single season, no evidence that traveled faster than patience could carry it. She reached into her coat pocket and found the tally sheet, not the original, which had worn through its folds 2 years ago and been transferred to the first notebook for safekeeping, but the current version, updated through the most recent delivery invoices and hay costs and cattle weight estimates. The numbers were what she had calculated they would be when she sat in that rented room and did the arithmetic that the county clerk had looked at twice, and still not fully believed. Not remarkable numbers, not the kind that made a person wealthy in any visible external sense, but numbers that sustained the operation, that built slightly on themselves from one season to the next, that described a farm that was functioning rather than failing, and would continue to function because its foundation was something the dry years could not take, and the skeptics had not seen. She folded the tally sheet back into her pocket. The tractor started on the first try, the engine settling immediately into its even, working rhythm, and she drove back toward the barn through the pale morning light, the greenhouse windows catching the first direct sun of the day and holding it the way they had held it every morning since she had set the last pane of salvage glass into its frame with her own hands. The lower pasture trough was full when she passed it. The spring below the capstone was running steady, cold and clear, the same as it had been running through every morning of the 2.5 years since she had knelt in the corner of that field and pulled the leaf litter back from the edge of something that had been there all along, waiting without urgency, as buried things did, for someone patient enough to come looking.